Imagine waking up one day to find your memories are not your own. The people you love, strangers, the past you believed in, fabricated. It's a chilling thought, like something torn from the pages of dystopian fiction. But what if that story isn't fiction at all? What if it's a reflection of programs that actually existed? Programs designed not just to spy on us, but to reshape the very fabric of our perception. Throughout the 20th century and into the digital age, government agencies around the world have quietly invested in tools of influence far more subtle and far more powerful than tanks or missiles. They understood a fundamental truth: control the narrative, and you control the people. Across continents and decades, projects were born not just to monitor or persuade, but to sculpt reality itself. From laboratories and boardrooms to TV studios and digital servers, this new warfare was not waged with bullets, but with ideas, images, emotions, and beliefs. This documentary series explores one uncomfortable question: how much of what we call reality has been engineered? Not in a metaphorical sense, but deliberately, scientifically, systemically. We begin with the haunting remnants of MK-Ultra, a program that sought to wipe human memory clean and rewrite identity. We then follow trails through television newsrooms manipulated by Operation Mockingbird to domestic surveillance campaigns that dismantled social movements from the inside. Each chapter focuses on a different era, a different tool, a different mask. Whether it's manipulating mass media, infiltrating activist circles, or reshaping consensus through AI-powered social media influence, the core mission remains the same: shape perception, create consensus, engineer belief. And yet, these stories are not merely warnings about institutional power. They are windows into something more human. Why are we so vulnerable to illusion? Why do we cling to the stories we're given? In every experiment, every classified file, and every haunting testimony, there lies an insight about the human mind and its hunger for meaning, even at the cost of truth. As we embark on this 14-part journey, we won't indulge in wild speculation or political finger-pointing. Instead, we'll ask quiet, necessary questions. What happens when our memories aren't ours? When reality is filtered before it reaches us? When truth becomes whatever survives the algorithm? These aren't just historical curiosities. They're living legacies encoded in the systems that now deliver our news, structure our beliefs, and fill our screens. This series isn't about fear. It's about clarity. It's about seeing how the past shapes the lens through which we view the present. Because in a world where reality can be engineered, remembering what's real is an act of courage. Welcome to a story not about the future, but the present, one that's already unfolding around you. One that begins not with a bang, but with a whisper. What if reality isn't what you think it is? It began with a silence, cold, clinical, and calculated. Behind the sealed doors of research labs and psychiatric hospitals, a program took root. COINTELPRO would redefine the boundaries of the human mind. They called it MK-Ultra. Between 1953 and 1973, the CIA launched what would become the most notorious mind control experiment in American history. At its core, MK-Ultra wasn't about intelligence gathering. It was about erasure. What if you could delete a person's identity and replace it with something entirely new? What if memory, belief, and behavior could be rewritten like a page in a notebook? The techniques were brutal. Subjects, often unwilling and unaware, were subjected to drug-induced comas lasting weeks. While unconscious, they were bombarded with repeating audio messages for up to 20 hours a day. The goal? Not to persuade them, but to overwrite them. Memory, perception, personality, everything malleable, everything replaceable. Dr. Ewan Cameron, one of the program's lead figures, called it psychic driving. Patients under his care at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal were broken down to their most basic psychological state, blank slates, then rebuilt according to script. One woman emerged from treatment unable to recognize her husband, her children, or even her own name. Another was convinced she had committed murder, a murder that never happened. The terrifying part? These weren't just isolated outcomes. According to declassified documents, the techniques worked. With enough repetition, suggestion, and sensory manipulation, the human mind could be remodeled. Entire memories could be fabricated, personalities extinguished, and new ones constructed, memories that felt as real as any lived experience. The program didn't limit itself to psychiatric patients. Prisoners, sex workers, and drug addicts were often targeted, chosen for their perceived expendability. Many suffered lasting trauma from severe depression to permanent cognitive damage. Others became unwitting experiments in psychological warfare. Perhaps most disturbing were reports of so-called Manchurian candidates, individuals programmed to perform specific tasks, including assassinations, without conscious memory. Activated by a keyword or signal, they'd carry out their mission and then return to normal life, unaware of what they'd done. Chemical manipulation played a central role. LSD was administered to over 6,000 subjects, sometimes daily, sometimes without their knowledge. Hallucinations weren't the end goal, they were the gateway. Reality itself became unstable, fluid. Many subjects reported lingering illusions that persisted long after the drugs wore off. The line between what was real and what was imagined was shattered, and as the Cold War raged, the CIA's interest in consciousness control expanded. MKUltra's techniques would go on to inform interrogation protocols, surveillance operations, and other classified psychological tools still cloaked in secrecy today. The program was officially shut down in 1973, but its echoes remain. In its wake, it left behind more than just damaged minds. It left behind a chilling possibility that the human mind, our memories and perceptions, can be hacked, rewritten, and controlled. We like to believe our thoughts are our own, that our memories are sacred, untouchable, but MKUltra shattered that illusion. It proved that with enough pressure, chemical, psychological, emotional, truth could be manufactured. So what does that mean for us today? That mean how much of what we remember, what we believe, what we feel certain of, is truly ours? And how much has been shaped, gently or forcefully, by hands we never saw coming? In the shadows of MKUltra, one thing became clear. The most powerful battlefield isn't land, sea, or sky. It's the human mind. It's the 1960s. The television flickers in a suburban living room. A trusted anchor delivers the nightly news with calm authority, eyes steady, voice reassuring. Families gather around, absorbing the world through a carefully constructed lens. But behind that lens, behind the headlines, interviews, and documentaries, was an operation designed to shape not just information, but belief. It was called Operation Mockingbird. At the height of the Cold War, the CIA launched an ambitious media infiltration program. Their mission? Control the narrative, manipulate perception, turn journalism into a tool of influence. By embedding assets in major newspapers, television networks, and publishing houses, Mockingbird blurred the line between truth and propaganda. Over 400 American journalists worked with the CIA, some knowingly, others as unwitting pawns. These weren't fringe publications. We're talking about giants like CBS, The New York Times, Newsweek, and Time magazine. These agents didn't just report news, they shaped it. Stories were amplified or buried depending on their usefulness to U.S. intelligence objectives. Coverage of foreign conflicts, political movements, and even domestic issues was tailored to align with government interests. The public wasn't informed. They were guided. The reach was staggering. The CIA funded over 1,000 books, many of them bestsellers, promoting specific ideologies under the guise of independent scholarship. Popular novels and academic texts alike became covert vessels for messaging. And it didn't stop with print. Hollywood, too, played a role. Spy thrillers, war epics, political dramas, films that framed America as noble and its enemies as monstrous, often had agency fingerprints on them. These stories weren't merely entertainment. They were psychological operations designed to reinforce trust, obedience, and fear. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Control what people see, and you control what they believe. By shaping the flow of information, the CIA could create manufactured consensus. Within days, a false narrative could become common knowledge. Disagreement became taboo. Doubt became unpatriotic. One internal memo described this as the ability to own reality, to decide what the public believes is happening, regardless of what's actually happening. The program was exposed in the 1970s during congressional investigations. Officially, it ended there. But did it? Modern whistleblowers and leaked documents suggest that while the name Mockingbird may have been retired, its spirit lives on, transformed by digital tools and social media. The new landscape is even more powerful, even more subtle. Algorithms and influencers now deliver curated reality at scale. Today, you don't need a CIA handler to shape opinion. You just need access to data, a content distribution platform, and a narrative. And those who control these platforms? They aren't elected. They're not bound by journalism's ethical codes. Yet they influence billions of minds every day. Reflecting on Operation Mockingbird raises an unsettling question. How many of our beliefs are truly our own? How many were gently planted, repeated often enough to feel like truth? It's easy to scoff at propaganda in hindsight, to point fingers at the past. But propaganda's true genius lies in its invisibility. When it's working, you don't notice it. You think you're thinking for yourself. So next time you watch the news, scroll through your feed, or read a trending story, pause. Ask not just what's being said, but who benefits from you believing it. Because as Operation Mockingbird proved, reality isn't always discovered. Sometimes it's delivered. The late 1960s were turbulent years. Cities pulsed with protest. Civil rights marches filled the streets, and young Americans began questioning the moral fabric of their country. But while movements rose from the ground up, something sinister stirred beneath the surface, a government program designed to dismantle them from within. It was called COINTELPRO, the FBI's counterintelligence program. Between 1956 and 1971, COINTELPRO targeted civil rights leaders, activists, and community organizers. But this wasn't ordinary surveillance. The FBI didn't just watch. They interfered, manipulated, and orchestrated chaos. The method was simple: destroy trust. Agents infiltrated organizations posing as loyal members. They forged letters, spread rumors, and manufactured betrayals. Entire friendships, marriages, and movements collapsed under the weight of deception. The idea wasn't to fight a movement. It was to make it self-destruct. Within the Black Panther Party, COINTELPRO operatives staged false conflicts between local chapters, fabricating evidence of internal plots. Forged letters implied betrayals and threats. In some cases, fake shootings were staged to deepen divisions. The Panthers, already under siege from law enforcement, turned against themselves. It wasn't just black activists. Anti-war groups, feminist organizations, and student movements were also targeted. Each was carefully dissected, its social bonds studied, and then ruptured through manipulation. Agents sowed paranoia, and once paranoia took hold, unity shattered. There was a term for one of their favorite tactics: bad jacketing. It meant branding a devoted member as a traitor, often using fake documents or anonymous tips. The accused would be ostracized, or worse, the group would implode. No outside intervention needed. This wasn't random cruelty. It was social engineering at scale. The FBI learned that if you distort the story people tell themselves about their own community, you don't need to destroy it from the outside. It will eat itself alive. And when psychological manipulation wasn't enough, harassment followed. Agents conducted neutralization campaigns, late-night phone calls, fabricated emergencies, fake news stories, and endless surveillance. Targets were isolated, ridiculed, and often pushed to break down. Some, like Martin Luther King Jr., received anonymous letters urging them to take their own lives. By the early 1970s, revelations about COINTELPRO shocked the nation. Congressional hearings confirmed what many had suspected. The government had turned its psychological warfare inward, treating dissent as treason. But even after the program was officially disbanded, the blueprint remained. The techniques, information manipulation, infiltration, social disruption, didn't disappear. They evolved. Digital surveillance, online misinformation, and coordinated character attacks now perform the same functions once carried out through forged letters and phone taps. What's most chilling about COINTELPRO isn't its methods, it's its effectiveness. A well-placed lie can unravel years of trust. A forged note can fracture an entire movement. The program revealed that truth isn't always the most powerful weapon in politics. Sometimes it's deception. But there's another lesson buried within that history, a human one. Movements built on trust and shared purpose can survive external pressure, but not internal doubt. Once you convince people to distrust one another, reality itself begins to crumble. Half a century later, that dynamic still echoes through society, in polarized communities, fractured online spaces, and the quiet suspicion that we can no longer tell who's genuine and who's not. COINTELPRO taught the world something hauntingly simple. You don't need to silence the truth if you can make people doubt it. It began with a flicker in the sky, a mysterious light, a shape too fast, too silent, too otherworldly. For decades, sightings of unidentified flying objects filled news reports and late-night conversations. But what if the truth behind those stories wasn't just hidden, but actively rewritten? Between 1952 and 1969, the U.S. Air Force operated Project Blue Book. Officially, it was a scientific investigation into UFO sightings. Unofficially, it was something else entirely. A psychological operation designed to control public perception of the unexplained. Behind the classified doors of Blue Book, the mission was clear: dismiss, discredit, and if necessary, distort. No matter how credible the witnesses, pilots, radar operators, law enforcement, reports were filtered through a lens of skepticism. When conventional explanations didn't fit, new ones were invented. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, the program's chief scientific consultant, would later admit that pressure was constant. His job wasn't to seek truth, it was to close cases. Sometimes with weather balloons, sometimes with astronomical phenomena, and sometimes with outright fabrication. The truth, if too disruptive, had to be managed. When witness testimony couldn't be dismissed, memory became the target. Psychological techniques, suggestive questioning, planted explanations, even public ridicule, were used to alter how people remembered their encounters. Many came to doubt their own experiences. What began as certainty dissolved into confusion. But Blue Book didn't stop at suppression. It created reality distortions of its own. The military staged mock UFO incidents using experimental aircraft, balloons, and lighting effects. These hoaxes served a purpose: to drown out authentic sightings with noise. If everything was suspect, nothing was credible. Two sets of files were kept, one public, filled with tidy explanations, the other classified, filled with cases that defied logic, craft maneuvering in ways that violated known physics, objects tracked on radar but invisible to the eye, and multiple witness accounts that couldn't be debunked. The media played its role. Certain stories were promoted, others buried. Blue Book worked closely with journalists to guide the narrative, ensuring the American public focused on the absurd rather than the plausible. The alien became a joke, a fantasy, and belief in UFOs became a cultural punchline. Yet the sightings continued. Trained observers, many of them military personnel, reported encounters that couldn't be explained. But by then, the public lens was clouded. Doubt had been seeded. Reality had been successfully reshaped. More than a cover-up, Blue Book was a demonstration of psychological control. It showed that if you can shape the narrative early and repeat it often, you don't need to hide the truth. You just need to make people unsure they ever saw it. Today, as governments begin to acknowledge the existence of unidentified aerial phenomena, we are left with decades of engineered confusion. The lines between what was real, what was staged, and what was forgotten have blurred. The story of Project Blue Book isn't just about UFOs, it's about belief, about how fragile our understanding of reality becomes when the gatekeepers of information decide what we're allowed to see and what we're allowed to believe. In the end, Blue Book's most powerful discovery wasn't what flew above us. It was what lies within us, the vulnerability of memory, the ease with which perception can be shifted, and the quiet truth that in the battle between experience and narrative, narrative often wins. So next time you look to the sky and wonder, consider this. Maybe what's most extraordinary isn't what's out there. It's how easily we've been convinced not to see it. It started quietly, like so many things in the shadows do. In 1967, the CIA launched Operation Chaos, an effort not to confront foreign enemies, but to monitor and manipulate American citizens. What began as surveillance soon evolved into something much darker, a war on domestic perception. Over 300,000 Americans were placed under surveillance. But this wasn't simple data collection. Chaos was designed to reshape political consciousness by infiltrating anti-war groups, civil rights movements, and student organizations. The goal wasn't just to watch, it was to steer. CIA operatives didn't sit on the sidelines. They embedded themselves within activist groups pretending to be allies, while subtly redirecting agendas. They encouraged extreme behavior, proposed dangerous actions, and whispered divisive ideas in moments of tension. With enough provocation, a peaceful march could turn chaotic. A movement could fracture. These agents exploited vulnerability, personal struggles, emotional triggers, family tension, anything that could be used to manipulate a leader or destabilize a group was fair game. And it worked. Many organizations crumbled, never realizing the discontent came from within. The operation also employed disinformation. Fake news was seeded in underground publications. False stories about government crackdowns, fabricated betrayals, and manipulated protest outcomes were circulated to demoralize activists and distort public perception. Reality itself became elastic. In some cases, the CIA crafted entire narratives about protests that never happened or incidents that were staged for cameras. These false narratives would then circulate in the media, reshaping how Americans perceived the political climate. Meanwhile, real events were silenced or downplayed. Operation Chaos blurred the line between journalism and manipulation. CIA-connected writers contributed to underground newspapers, feeding false information into movements that trusted them. A movement that relies on information to organize becomes paralyzed when it no longer knows what's true. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of chaos was its precision. Psychological profiles were created for activists, dossiers not just on their politics, but on their emotional weak points, past traumas, and internal fears. These weren't just surveillance files. They were weapons of influence. These insights allowed the agency to predict behavior and plan interventions that would feel natural, even inevitable, to the target. People were pushed into actions they thought were their own, decisions they believed they had freely made. Academic institutions weren't safe either. Universities became theaters of subtle manipulation. CIA assets influenced research, steered conferences, and funded publications that aligned with the agency's narrative. The goal: to shape intellectual consensus and prevent movements from gaining credibility in scholarly circles. Chaos wasn't merely about containment. It was about distortion. By the time many movements collapsed, they believed they had done so under their own weight. That was the genius of the program. It convinced people that their disillusionment, their defeat, was organic. Officially, chaos ended in the 1970s, but its methods lived on, adapted for a digital age. Online disinformation, algorithmic shaping of discourse, and targeted psychological profiling now accomplish in seconds what once took years. The story of Operation Chaos teaches us something vital. Control over reality doesn't always require force. Sometimes all it takes is a whisper, a rumor, a slight nudge at the right moment. And perhaps that's the most haunting legacy of all. Not just that people were watched, but that their very thoughts, fears, and beliefs were sculpted by unseen hands. In the end, the question remains: when does persuasion become control? And when does control become reality? On a remote patch of Alaskan tundra, a forest of towering antennas reaches into the sky like metallic fingers. To most, it's just another government research site. But for those who look closer, the High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, HAARP, is something far more provocative, a doorway into the manipulation of the mind through the atmosphere itself. Officially, HAARP was designed to study the ionosphere, but declassified documents and leaked patents suggest a different aim altogether: the capacity to influence human consciousness on a mass scale. The technology is staggering. HAARP's antenna array can project 3.6 million watts of electromagnetic energy into the ionosphere, creating focused, high-frequency pulses. These pulses can be aimed at specific regions, affecting the electromagnetic environment that surrounds and influences human brain activity. Brain waves operate on frequencies, and HAARP, according to its patents, can replicate those frequencies. By aligning its signals with natural brain rhythms, HAARP could hypothetically induce emotional states: euphoria, confusion, depression, even aggression. Not through suggestion, but through environmental tuning. Reports have emerged of mood shifts in communities near HAARP test sites, sleep disturbances, memory fog, spikes in anxiety. Though correlation doesn't prove causation, the patterns are enough to raise eyebrows among researchers. And in war zones, military reports suggest the system has been used to pacify populations, without bullets, without sound, just silence and waves. But HAARP's reach isn't limited to local fields. The system is capable of generating disturbances that ripple through the magnetosphere, possibly influencing populations across continents. Think of it as dropping a stone in the pond of the Earth's electromagnetic field and watching the ripples bend consciousness. Even more alarming are claims of targeted psychological interference. Theoretically, HAARP could tailor specific frequencies to resonate with individual brain signatures. A signature broadcast, keyed to a person's unique neural rhythm, could influence decision-making, emotion, or memory retrieval. Mobile versions of the HAARP system have allegedly been developed on ships, aircraft, even portable transmitters. These could be deployed globally, subtly shifting mood or perception in a city, a protest, or a voting population without a single word being spoken. HAARP's developers detailed its applications not just for warfare, but for behavioral conditioning. It's the ultimate invisible influence. Unlike media manipulation or propaganda, electromagnetic influence doesn't need to convince you. It simply changes how you feel from within. Local communities near HAARP have reported unusual phenomena: sudden mental health crises, suicide clusters, disorientation. And while science hasn't drawn definitive connections, the patterns raise haunting questions about the cost of tampering with forces we barely understand. The most disturbing part? HAARP might only be the prototype. If these technologies can be scaled, refined, and deployed globally, the very fabric of what it means to think freely could be rewritten, not by ideology, but by resonance. There's a lesson buried in HAARP's story, a quiet warning. We often imagine mind control as overt, a command, a screen, a voice in your head. But what if control doesn't look like that at all? What if it feels like your own thought, your own choice, your own mood? When external frequencies match our internal rhythms, where do we draw the line between self and signal? HAARP reminds us that reality isn't just what we see, it's how we feel it. And when that can be tuned like a radio, the question isn't whether we're being influenced, it's whether we'll ever notice. It was a plan written in the cold language of military strategy, but its implications were anything but abstract. In 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff approved a series of proposals that would reshape the meaning of reality and patriotism. The operation was called Northwoods. At its core, Operation Northwoods wasn't just about military deception. It was about creating false realities. Events so believable, so emotionally potent, that the American public would demand war. The targets? The American people. One plan involved staging terrorist attacks on U.S. soil, including in major cities and military installations. Real explosions, fake victims, planted evidence. Everything meticulously crafted to appear as Cuban aggression. The response would be swift and unquestioned. Military retaliation, regime change, war. Another proposal outlined the hijacking of commercial aircraft by operatives posing as Cuban agents. The planes would disappear or be destroyed, and the media would report the tragedy as an act of war. Lives would be lost, grief would be real. But the story behind it all would be fiction. There were even suggestions to sacrifice American military personnel in staged attacks, creating martyrs to justify intervention. The imagery, flags draped over coffins, teary-eyed widows, was not just anticipated. It was engineered. Northwoods wasn't implemented. President John F. Kennedy rejected the proposals. But the documents remained. A blueprint for manufactured consent, proof that entire realities could be scripted to guide public emotion and political action. The methods were disturbingly thorough. Fake radio transmissions, forged documents, staged photographs, and coordinated media coverage were all part of the toolkit. If a lie is told with enough detail and repeated often enough, it becomes memory. This wasn't imagination. It was policy. The unsettling truth is that Operation Northwoods was never about Cuba alone. It outlined a method, a template for any future conflict where public opinion needed to be moved quickly and decisively. And while the specific operation was shelved, its spirit lived on. In the decades that followed, many analysts have pointed to similar techniques in conflicts around the world. False flag operations, media coordination, and synthetic crises became tools of influence not just for enemies abroad, but for steering perception at home. What Northwoods revealed was a terrifying possibility. That reality itself could be constructed with enough coordination. That truth could be manufactured not by censoring facts, but by flooding the world with believable fictions. And perhaps most disquieting of all is this. The tools needed to create those realities have only become more powerful. Today, with digital effects, AI-generated content, and real-time media manipulation, it's easier than ever to fabricate events that appear unquestionably real. The lesson of Northwoods lingers in modern airwaves. It reminds us that the line between fact and fiction isn't always broken by lies. It's blurred by design. So how do we respond? By asking harder questions, by recognizing the power of emotional manipulation, and by remembering that patriotism doesn't mean accepting every story we're told. It means defending the truth, even when it's inconvenient. Because the greatest threat to freedom isn't always the enemy outside our borders. Sometimes It's the story we're asked to believe inside them. Operation Northwoods never came to pass. But the idea that a nation could be led to war through illusion remains a chilling, cautionary tale. One that asks not just what's real, but who decides what's real in the first place. In the digital age, battles aren't just fought with armies, they're fought with algorithms. In 2016, the U.S. State Department established the Global Engagement Center, or GEC. Publicly, it was framed as a noble effort to counter foreign propaganda. Behind the scenes, it became something more, a central node in a vast web of digital perception control. The GEC doesn't just monitor online discourse, it shapes it. Working alongside social media companies, search engines, and artificial intelligence developers, the center can detect emerging narratives within minutes and respond before they gain traction. The goal isn't to debate ideas, it's to engineer what is seen, shared, and believed. One of its primary tools? Fake personas. Networks of synthetic social media accounts, powered by AI, mimic everyday users. They post, comment, share, and engage, creating the illusion of consensus. If an idea needs to spread, these bots amplify it. If a narrative needs to disappear, they drown it out or report it into silence. But the influence doesn't stop at the post level. The GEC can affect what you find when you search for something. By working with search engine algorithms and content moderation systems, it ensures that certain viewpoints rise to the top while others vanish beneath layers of filters. It's not censorship in the traditional sense. It's optimization, and it's invisible. If you've ever wondered why only one side of a debate seems to dominate your feed, or why some perspectives feel strangely absent, it may not be because those views are unpopular. It may be because they were quietly removed before you had a chance to see them. The GEC also targets content creators, labeling some as threats, discrediting others through coordinated campaigns. In some cases, individuals have found their reach suddenly throttled, their posts buried, their audiences fractured, all without explanation. Even academia isn't immune. The GEC has been linked to funding research and promoting studies that reinforce official narratives, while deprioritizing or ignoring dissenting findings. Through citation manipulation and publication steering, it helps create the appearance of scientific consensus where none may actually exist. Most people imagine propaganda as something obvious: banners, slogans, state-controlled TV. But today's propaganda is softer, smarter, and more pervasive. It wears the face of normalcy. It hides in your recommendations, your news alerts, your trending hashtags. The GEC's most sophisticated tactic is what it calls cognitive security. It works not by attacking ideas directly, but by managing the mental environment in which those ideas are considered. It inoculates populations by exposing them to diluted versions of opposing viewpoints, then overwhelming them with counter-narratives. The result? Resistance fades before it even forms. This isn't just about international policy. American citizens are targets too. Anyone who deviates from mainstream narratives may find themselves flagged not for what they say, but for the influence they might have. What we see, what we share, what we believe, these are no longer entirely organic processes. They're outcomes of systems designed to shape our mental terrain. And while we scroll, like, and retweet, the boundaries of acceptable thought are quietly, constantly redrawn. The GEC may be the face of today's information war, but it represents something older, the eternal struggle between control and curiosity. In this new era, the battlefield isn't a place, it's perception itself, and the most powerful weapon may not be what you see, but what you never had the chance to. There are places where science, mysticism, and espionage intersect, and Project Mockingbird was one of them. Launched quietly in the late 1960s, it was a lesser-known offshoot of MKUltra, but its goals were even more unorthodox. This wasn't about memory erasure or chemical control. It was about exploring the unexplored, the occult, psychic abilities, and the boundaries of human perception. The CIA wanted to know, could ancient rituals, mystical practices, and supernatural beliefs be weaponized? Could they alter consciousness, influence behavior, or even shift reality itself? To find out, they assembled a cast of unlikely collaborators: anthropologists, psychologists, parapsychologists, even self-proclaimed witches and occultists. These weren't charlatans or fringe eccentrics. They were researchers with credentials and open minds, drawn into a program that asked questions mainstream science refused to touch. The experiments ranged from the strange to the surreal. Subjects were guided through ritual ceremonies based on tribal traditions, ancient religious practices, and esoteric magical systems. Others were induced into trance states, encouraged to attempt astral projection, or immersed in carefully constructed mystical environments. The goal wasn't belief, it was effect. Could these experiences alter a subject's perception of reality? Could they implant ideas or emotional states that endured long after the ritual ended? The answer, again and again, was yes. Some subjects reported encounters with non-physical entities. Others experienced what they believed to be glimpses into other dimensions. These weren't hallucinations, at least not in the traditional sense. Brain scans and post-session interviews showed profound shifts in cognition, belief, and emotional orientation. Remote viewing, the ability to perceive distant or unseen targets through psychic means, became a major area of research. Some results were so precise that they stunned even hardened skeptics. Intelligence agencies began to take seriously the possibility that consciousness could extend beyond the body. But M. Kaufman didn't stop at individual experiments. It explored group dynamics as well. Could collective rituals create shared, altered states? Could entire crowds be influenced through synchronized experience? The findings suggested that mass rituals, religious gatherings, political rallies, even concerts, could be powerful tools for psychological influence. In altered states, participants became more suggestible, more unified, and more open to implanted narratives. Perhaps most unsettling were the experiments into belief implantation. By using a combination of sensory deprivation, rhythmic stimulation, psychoactive substances, and symbolic ritual, researchers found they could make subjects internalize new belief systems, even if those beliefs contradicted prior values. It wasn't just about programming behavior, it was about reshaping identity. The implications were staggering. If consciousness could be decoupled from physical experience, if belief systems could be engineered through ritual, if non-ordinary states of awareness could be replicated on demand, then the possibilities for psychological influence were almost limitless. Of course, much of M.K. Often's research remains classified. What's known comes from fragments, declassified memos, first-hand accounts, and related programs that later surfaced. But one thing is clear. The line between psychology and spirituality was not a boundary to the CIA. It was a frontier. In today's world, where mindfulness apps and psychedelic therapy are increasingly mainstream, M.K. Often reads less like an outlier and more like a prototype. It reminds us that consciousness is still one of the greatest mysteries and one of the most powerful tools. Reality, as M.K. Often suggested, may be far more flexible than we imagine, and those who learn to shape consciousness may also shape the future. When we ask what is real, we must also ask, who taught us to define it that way? By the mid-1980s, perception itself had become a strategic asset. The battlefield was no longer just territory or ideology. It was belief. In response, the Department of Defense formalized a quiet revolution in psychological operations with the creation of a specialized division, the Perception Management Office. This wasn't about spying. It was about sculpting. Reality itself became malleable, a product that could be engineered, packaged, and delivered. The Perception Management Office coordinated efforts across intelligence, media, academia, and entertainment. Its mandate was to ensure that the American public, and by extension the global audience, would interpret events in alignment with national interests. To do this, the office moved beyond information control and into the realm of experience design. Using immersive technology, narrative theory, and behavioral psychology, they developed protocols to create what they called experiential reality modification. Imagine this. You enter a simulated environment so real, so emotionally intense, that it imprints on your psyche more deeply than your actual memories. You come away changed, not just informed, but transformed. That was the goal. Not to tell people what to think, but to give them experiences that made certain beliefs feel self-evident. Virtual reality played a central role. Sophisticated simulations allowed test subjects to relive historical events, fictional crises, or political scenarios in a fully immersive way. Emotional truth replaced factual inquiry. What you felt became more important than what you could verify. These tools weren't limited to labs. Hollywood studios, video game developers, and television producers collaborated, knowingly or not, in crafting narratives that mirrored strategic goals. Spy thrillers glorified surveillance. War movies framed conflicts as necessary and heroic. Even science fiction was used to seed acceptance of future technologies and policy shifts. The office referred to this as narrative seeding. A storyline would appear in entertainment years before its real-world counterpart. When the actual policy emerged, the public was already primed. The story felt familiar. Resistance felt unnatural. But perhaps the most sophisticated tactic involved manipulating the frameworks through which people interpreted the world. Rather than arguing facts, perception managers targeted the mental models people use to make sense of facts. By subtly shifting cultural archetypes, what a hero looks like, what danger feels like, what justice means, they could ensure that new information would be processed in ways that supported desired conclusions. This wasn't about deception. It was about context. When you control the lens, you control what people see, even when their eyes are open. Artificial intelligence further enhanced these efforts. By analyzing social media, behavioral data, and psychological profiles, the office could predict how different populations would respond to specific narratives. Messaging could then be tailored for maximum resonance. Public discourse, once the chaotic heart of democracy, became something closer to a guided tour, efficient, persuasive, and largely invisible in its influence. The Perception Management Office showed that reality need not be denied or hidden. It could be redirected, augmented, enhanced. It could be engineered. We live in a world now where stories shape elections, where simulations alter beliefs, where emotional experiences override critical thought. And often we feel these changes not as manipulation, but as clarity, as if we've finally understood something profound, when in fact we've simply been nudged. Perception is fragile. It bends with emotion, memory, repetition, and in the hands of those who understand its architecture, it becomes the most powerful tool of all. So the next time a story feels too perfect, too cinematic, too emotionally satisfying, pause. Ask yourself, did I arrive at this truth? Or was I guided there? Reality used to be something we shared, a common understanding of events, facts, and truths. But in the digital age, reality is more fragmented, more fluid, and more susceptible to quiet forms of engineering than ever before. Nowhere is this more evident than in what some call the digital reality matrix, a network of influence that operates not with brute force, but through clicks, scrolls, and algorithms. At the center of this matrix are systems like social media platforms, search engines, and artificial intelligence, technologies that learn how we think, then subtly reshape the world we see. The content you consume, the topics that trend, even the comments you read are not random. They're curated, ranked, filtered, and served with precision. What makes this system so effective is its invisibility. You aren't told what to believe. You're simply shown what others seem to believe. And dully, without realizing it, your perception aligns with the narrative most visible to you. These digital platforms operate with powerful psychological tools. They know how to trigger outrage, reward conformity, and punish dissent. Every interaction is data. Every click becomes a vote for the version of reality that gets amplified. Artificial intelligence takes this further. With real-time monitoring of conversations, the system can detect emerging ideas before they spread and apply algorithmic pressure to suppress them. Search results can be reordered. Posts can be shadow banned. Entire topics can vanish from your digital environment, not because they're false, but because they're inconvenient. The digital matrix doesn't just suppress, it also creates. Entire bot networks, accounts designed to look human, are deployed to simulate public opinion. They share, like, and comment in coordinated patterns to manufacture the illusion of consensus. If enough fake people say something, real people begin to believe it. And when belief becomes normalized, it becomes truth. This isn't just a matter of opinion. It affects elections, public health decisions, foreign policy, and social stability. The narratives that rise to the top shape how we vote, how we relate to one another, and how we understand the world. The most sophisticated part of the digital reality matrix is what's called information inoculation. By exposing users to weak versions of alternative ideas, paired with strong counter-arguments, platforms can make people psychologically resistant to different perspectives before they even encounter them. It's the digital equivalent of building an immune system against unwanted truths. The GEC and other agencies have partnered with these platforms to monitor and guide this process. Their stated goal is stability, security, and protection from misinformation. But stability is a slippery word. Whose stability? And at what cost to curiosity, dissent, or discovery? Even academia plays a role. Research is increasingly influenced by funding tied to specific outcomes. Studies that support dominant narratives are promoted. Others quietly disappear. Science itself, once a method of questioning, becomes another tool of reinforcement. In this world, reality isn't what's true. It's what's permitted. And yet, the most troubling aspect isn't the manipulation itself. It's how natural it feels. When reality is shaped to mirror our desires, our fears, and our biases, we rarely question it. It feels comfortable, familiar. Right, but comfort isn't truth, and familiarity isn't fact. We are living in a time where the tools of control are softer than ever. No censorship, no force, just subtle nudges in what we see and what we don't. And that raises a question we must all consider. When information is shaped for us, who are we really becoming? Are we seeing the world, or only a version designed to keep us from looking any deeper? By now, the pattern is unmistakable. From Cold War experiments to digital age algorithms, the boundaries of reality have been pushed, pulled, and redrawn. But the question remains, what is the end game? For some, it was never just about control. It was about transformation, reprogramming reality itself through belief, emotion, and perception. And nothing embodies that ambition more than the idea of psychological warfare turned inward, not just on individuals or groups, but on the very structure of collective consciousness. The government programs we've explored, MK Ultra, Mockingbird, Chaos, HAARP, and more, reveal something extraordinary. Reality is not as fixed as we believe. It is shaped by what we remember, what we're told, what we feel, and what we trust. And when those things can be manipulated, so too can the core of who we are. Consider the legacy of memory erasure. If identity can be erased and rewritten, what remains of authenticity? Or look at Operation Northwoods, where events could be fabricated with such precision that public emotion would rush to meet them as if they were true. These aren't just isolated case studies. They're a philosophy in motion, a philosophy that sees the human mind not as sacred, but as programmable. And the more technology advances, the more seamless that programming becomes. In a world where experiences can be simulated, consensus can be manufactured, and dissent can be algorithmically diluted, we arrive at a chilling threshold, a reality so carefully designed that truth becomes irrelevant. Today, we carry the tools of perception in our pockets. Phones, apps, and news feeds deliver a never-ending stream of curated stimuli. We're offered a buffet of truths, personalized to our tastes, fears, and identities, and we consume them not just willingly, but gratefully. But what if this personalization is the trap? What if the comfort of tailored content, familiar narratives, and agreeable opinions is precisely what prevents us from seeing beyond the veil? The truth is, we are no longer passive recipients of information. We are participants in the shaping of reality, sometimes knowingly, but often not. Our engagement, our attention, our emotional responses all feed back into systems that learn from us, adapt to us, and subtly guide us. The implications are staggering. What does freedom mean in a world where every choice is preconditioned by invisible forces? What does identity mean when our memories and beliefs are shaped by engineered experiences? This is not the plot of a dystopian novel. This is the culmination of decades of real programs, real technologies, and real strategies, all aimed at one central goal: control of perception. But amid the unease, there is something powerful: awareness. The moment we recognize how reality is engineered, we begin to reclaim the ability to question it, to resist it, to reshape it on our own terms. Because reality, at its core, is a shared agreement. And like any agreement, it can be renegotiated. So we return to the most human of questions, not what is real, but who gets to decide what is real. The answers will not come easily. But in asking, in looking deeper, in pushing beyond the surface, we take the first step toward a reality that belongs to us again. One shaped not by manipulation, but by understanding. In the end, we return to where we began, with a question that haunts the edges of every screen, every memory, every headline: what is real? Across 13 chapters, we've uncovered stories that blur the boundary between truth and illusion. Government programs that erased memories, manipulated emotions, distorted public discourse, and engineered events, not as fiction, as documented fact. But these stories were never just about the past. They were about us, about how fragile our grasp on reality can be when shaped by forces we don't see, or worse, don't question. MK Ultra showed us that the human mind can be wiped and rewritten. Operation Mockingbird revealed how the news could become narrative theater. COINTELPRO weaponized trust. HAARP bent electromagnetic fields to influence emotion, and digital influence operations taught algorithms to whisper in our own voice. Each project shared a common understanding: perception is power. And the greatest form of control isn't physical, it's cognitive. If you shape what people see, what they remember, and what they believe, you don't need to silence them. They will silence themselves. We now live in a world where every experience can be designed, every story optimized, every belief predicted. We scroll, we watch, we listen, but more often than not, we do so within frames chosen for us. Realities constructed not by natural discovery, but by design. And yet, this story is not one of despair. It's a story of awakening. Knowing the architecture of manipulation allows us to step outside it, to become observers of our own thoughts, to hold our beliefs up to the light and ask, where did this come from? Because the future isn't determined by how reality is shaped, it's determined by how we respond to that shaping. We can choose to accept the stories we're given, or we can begin to tell our own. We can choose to see disagreement not as danger, but as the heartbeat of freedom. We can protect the integrity of memory, question the familiar, and resist the seduction of manufactured certainty. We can remember that truth isn't what comforts us, it's what challenges us. In a world where reality is up for grabs, the most radical act is to seek clarity. So ask yourself, not just once, but every day, is what I believe my own? Is what I feel the product of experience or suggestion? And when I call something real, who benefits from that belief? The power to shape reality has always existed. The question is, will we use it to control one another or to better understand ourselves? This is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a new way of seeing, not with fear, but with open eyes. Because now you know, and once you know, you cannot unsee.